Greetings, everybody. Welcome to another Alkebulan Awakening Series in conjunction with Kumbukeni. I'm excited today. I'm jumping the gun now. My name is, I'm getting too excited. My name is Oladile Dosumu. I'm the co-founder of Alkebulan, Emerging Alkebulan. And you know what our purpose is: to basically decolonize the minds of our people and awaken our consciousness. Unduku.
Karibuni, asanteni. Thank you all for joining us, my fellow on Ubuntu. Today we get to hear from the source, I will say. We get to hear from the source so that you can stop accusing me of being racist and my brother of being racist. And so that you can stop accusing us of conspiracy theories. We want to bring the theories actually and blow up the conspiracy and show you that they are actually truths. The name is Nduku. I am the host on Kumbukeni, and every couple of weeks I join my brother to do collaboration sessions where we are countering the false narrative that has been propagated against Africa and Africans and telling our narrative from our perspective. So yes, looking forward to this conversation today.
Okay, my people, as you can see, we've got John Perkins. He's the author of Confessions of the Economic Hitman on the screen there. John, welcome to our series. So I'll let you introduce yourself and do your presentation, sir.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here. I feel very honored to be part of this. And so I guess what I would say is I'm John Perkins and a former economic hitman. My actual title was chief economist at a major Boston-based consulting firm. But really what I did was being an economic hitman. And what that entails is going to countries that have resources that our corporations covet. And Africa is covered with those countries. You know, Africa is the wealthiest continent in the world from a resource standpoint, the poorest from an income per capita perspective, but filled with resources. And so my job was to convince countries that had resources our corporations covet, like oil or other resources today, lithium and cobalt and the things that are necessary for the high-tech industry, to convince them to take huge loans from the World Bank or one of its sister organizations. The money, however, never actually went to the country. It went directly to banks in the United States, from banks in the United States to banks in the United States, to pay our corporations to build big infrastructure projects in that country. Things like power plants and industrial parks and highways and so on. And these are things that really benefited a few wealthy people in the country, because those are the people who own the industry and who benefit most from these big infrastructure projects, and also benefit big international corporations that wanted to drain the resources. But it doesn't help the majority of the people. In fact, money is diverted from education, healthcare, and other social services to pay off the interest on the loans. So actually the people suffer. But statistically, we can show that the economy grows when you invest in these infrastructure projects. The GDP grows. And I have to say that for many years, 7 years, I was only in this business for 10 years, but for about 7 of those years, I believed that what I was doing was a good thing, because I would look at these econometric models that show that you invest this money and the economy grows. It wasn't until toward the end of my career that I began to realize that GDP does not measure the wealth of the people. It doesn't measure prosperity. It just measures the wealth of a few wealthy families and international corporations. But that was my job, was to convince these countries to take these huge loans. And then in the end, the country couldn't repay its loan. And so we would go back in and say, hey, since you can't pay your loan, well, turn to the IMF. And the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, will help you restructure your loan. But in return, you need to meet certain conditionalities. For example, you need to sell your resource, oil or lithium, whatever it is, real cheap to our corporations without environmental and social regulations. Or let us build a military base on your soil. Or privatize your government industries and businesses and sell them to our investors cheap. Or, vote with us on the next United Nations vote against something that we don't like Cuba or whatever. So all of this pressure, what's considered to be kind of lumped under the title of neoliberal economics, controlling a country's policies. And that's what we would do. So in essence, we were enslaving countries. Colonialism. This was a new form of colonialism. It's not all that new, actually, but colonialism in the past was primarily done through military and some through debt and other things. But in more recent times, debt and economics has played a much, much larger role. And I have to say that we were very successful. And by the year 2000, the United States controlled world trade with more than 80% of the world. 80%, more than 80%.
Wow.
But, and there's some great graphics that show how since 2000, China has completely replaced us. And China basically does the same thing that we did. And they're creating another form of colonialism. And they're doing this very, very strongly in Africa. China now is the #1 trading partner in every continent except North America, and especially in Africa, in Latin America. So China's economic hitmen, in essence, have been much more effective than I ever was, or our economic hitmen. A number of years ago, I was asked to teach at an MBA program in Shanghai, China. And as soon as I got there, I quickly understood that they had hired me to do this because their students, who incidentally were hand-selected as the best and the brightest, the future leaders of China, were in this MBA program. These students wanted to learn from the mistakes I'd made as well as the successes, so they wouldn't repeat the mistakes and they would improve upon the successes. And China's done a magnificent job. I don't even like to use that word magnificent, but they've done a superior job at colonizing Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, even Europe to some degree, and in Asia. But I think what's most important to take away from all of this is that both the United States and China contribute almost 50% to the global economy and almost 50% to global pollution. And they impact all the rest of the world. So if we want to transition from this death economy, this economic system that's marching towards self-destruction, which is what we've created. The United States and China together have created this death economy, what economists are referring to as a death economy. We need to transition into a life economy. And somehow we need to make sure that both the United States and China come together to make this transition. And if they don't, if this doesn't happen, we're in a lot more trouble than we realize. So let me take a couple of minutes to talk about the death economy and the life economy.
Yes, please.
The death economy is, it revolves around the goal of maximizing short-term profits for corporations and materialistic consumption for the rest of us, maximizing these in the short term regardless of the social and environmental costs. And although this was an idea that had been around for some time, it really took off in 1976 when Milton Friedman won the Nobel Prize in Economics. And he said, the only responsibility of business is to maximize short-term profits, regardless of the social and environmental costs. And he was listened to by the world. Ronald Reagan promoted him, and Margaret Thatcher of England. So we've got two of you on here, one from the UK and one from the United States. The leaders of these two countries really promoted this concept, as did leaders all over the world. And corporate CEOs bought into it because it provided a very handy measure, profit, short-term profits. And now I'm only going to have this job for maybe 5 years as CEO, maybe 10, but now I'm told I got to maximize short-term profits. Well, that's easy. And it gave CEOs permission, and we might even say the mandate to do whatever it takes to maximize short-term profits, including using up the resources that their very corporation would need in the long term, because they weren't going to be around in the long term. So maximize short-term profits, including corrupting people. So there's all kinds of forms of corruption, and we've legalized it in the United States. And that was part of my job as an economic hitman, to make sure that we had laws in place that allowed us to essentially bribe public officials. That's what the laws here that permit corporations to give huge amounts of money to political campaigns. That's really a form of corruption. It's not, legally speaking, it's not corruption because it's been legalized. And, you know, part of my job when I went to other countries to convince presidents to to accept our loans, you know, I would basically say to them, in this hand, I've got billions of dollars for you and your family. If you accept this loan, you and your family are going to really benefit from this, because you're going to get scholarships for your kids. We're going to give you scholarships for your kids to go to college. My headquarters were in Boston, great universities. We'll get you into great universities, your kids and your friends' kids, and we'll give them full scholarships, and we'll give them jobs when they get out or during vacation. But if you decide not to accept this, then in this hand, I got a gun. Now, I didn't actually carry a gun, but these presidents knew, as I did, that behind me were people we call the jackals, who overthrow governments or assassinate leaders. And the United States, unfortunately, has a long history of this. It's admitted to it. And, you know, with Allende of Chile, and Arbenz of Guatemala, and Mossadegh of Iran, Lumumba of the Congo, and Diem of Vietnam, and many, many others. And so, in a way, my job was pretty easy. I mean, think about it. If I'm standing before you and I say, hey, here's a few $1 billion for you, or a gun, what are you going to do? And so, you know, what we really did was promote this death economy, and we've really created a situation today that we know is destroying life on our planet as we understand it. It's you know, we know the volcanoes are erupting. We know the oceans are rising. We know the glaciers are melting. We know but there's more droughts, there's more fires. We know this death economy is not working, and it's time to turn this around and create a life economy. So what I write about these days, the most recent book really deals with, my earlier books dealt with the U.S. economic hitmen, including those that every major international corporation now has that promote the interests of those corporations. And this third book in the trilogy is really talking about what China's economic hitmen have done to dominate the world, especially Africa and Latin America, the two continents that have incredible natural resources that everybody covets, and they've been taken over by China's economic hitmen. And so it's time to turn this around. And I don't know how much detail you want me to go into, but we can make a suggestion to individuals.
Everything is lay everything on the table, please. Everything.
Okay, so well, I could show you. I don't know how else to do these graphics, but this is the latest of. Can you see that? Look, China.
Yeah, okay.
You know, China back in 2018 when this came out, you can see China had 124 countries, whereas the number one trading partner versus U.S. is 56. But now that number has gone up significantly. China made huge progress during the pandemic.
And the red, just for everyone to understand who's looking at it, the red is China, the blue is the United States.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Oh, and now China is more than twice what the United States has, and that's all happened within the last couple of decades. And you know, part of it, frankly, is because the United States has failed in so many ways. We poured resources into Afghanistan and Iraq, and wars that were devastating to us. And while China put its resources into Africa and Latin America. attempting to get a foothold on those continents, which it has done very successfully. But I would like to say to your listeners that every one of us can play a role in transforming this death economy to a life economy. And, I think we all know that there's daily things we can do. We can use less fossil fuels. We can eat a more plant-based diet, perhaps. There's all kinds of things that we know. There's lists and lists and lists, and those are all important. But I like to suggest to people that what they really need to do is what gives them the most satisfaction in their life. Because we won't be successful if we don't do that. So I suggest to people, and this is in the book, you can get more details, but to ask every one of us and every one of your listeners to ask 5 questions of themselves. And the first question is, what do I most want to do with the rest of my life? What will bring me the greatest satisfaction? And I would answer that by saying, I want to write. I love to write. So I want to keep writing. I just don't want to ever stop writing. But I have a friend who's at the opposite end of the spectrum. He's a carpenter. And he says, I want to work with my hands in wood. And then the second question is, how can I do this in a way that promotes a transformation from a death to a life economy? How can I do this in a way that does that? And I would say that, okay, I'm going to write about things that inspire people to get involved, to make this transition.
Please repeat that second question. Oladile, do you mind muting? Please, John, please repeat that second question.
Okay, so the first question, what will give me the greatest satisfaction for the rest of my life? What can I do? And the second question is, how do I do that in a way that transforms the death economy to a life economy? So my answer was, I want to write. And how do I write in a way that'll do this? Well, I write books like what I do write, and, that I hope will inspire people to get involved. And my carpenter friend would say, well, I'm only going to use sustainable wood in my materials, and I'm going to replant a tree for every tree that's cut down to provide wood for the things that I do. And then the third question is, what's stopping me? What's getting in my way? What's blocking me from doing this? As a writer, I might say, well, I know that to be a successful writer, I have to write for at least 2 hours every day. I don't have time. I can't make that time to do that. And my carpenter friend might say, well, my clients don't want to spend the extra money to have me plant trees or use sustainable wood. So that takes us to the fourth question. And the fourth question is, when you go out and confront your blockage, how does it change your perception? And because we have to understand that everything in life, our reality is created through perceptions. So when you think about it, there's no United States, there's no China, there's no United Kingdom, except when enough people, and there's no culture, there's no religion. There's basically nothing that we humans do that we don't have to perceive of doing first. And once enough people have accepted a perception or codified it into law, it has a huge impact on reality. So this fourth question is, when I touch that which is holding me back, the blockage, the third question, when I go out and confront it instead of running from it, how does it change my perception? So for example, with me, as a writer, I would say, well, listen, so I say I don't have enough time, but I could turn off the television for 2 hours every night or get up a little earlier and write. And my carpenter friend says, well, I'm going to tell my clients that if there's a little extra price in the materials that they use because they're sustainable, that's not a cost. That's an investment in the future. You're making an investment in the future for you and your kids and everybody else. And then the fifth question is, what actions do I take immediately? As a writer, I got to start writing, and as the carpenter has to start, using sustainable materials and telling his clients that they're investing in the future. So we get these 5 questions. I'm going to quickly review them. What do I most want to do for the rest of my life? What will bring me the greatest bliss? 2, how do I do this in a way that helps transform the death economy to a life economy? 3, what's stopping me from doing this? What are the voices? Who's the parent whispering in my ear? You're not good enough. You're not big enough. You're not small enough. You don't have enough education. What's stopping me? And the fourth question is, when I really confront that which is stopping me, how does it change my perception so that I can take actions? And the fifth question is, what actions do I take?
Thank you, John. Okay, John, let's start dissecting what you're saying. Let's start asking some questions because of time, because I think there's a lot of questions that's come up on the feeds. They got a lot to ask you. The first thing I'm going to ask you, I don't know if you're following what's going on in Burkina Faso, in Niger, Mali at the moment. Are you following?
Yeah, and that's just the general news. I never worked there, so
obviously, we've got a young general who's basically trying to get rid of the death economy to bring life to Africa. So obviously, like you alluded to the World Bank, the IMF, and all that in your book, and how what they're doing basically to undermine and basically take things away from Africans. So my question would be, I'm an African, and what we're about here is basically to make our people understand the underhand behind what's going on in the continent. Based on your experience and see what's happening in Africa, what would you tell to me? Because there's a lot of people here who don't understand the dynamics of how politics works and the economics works. How can you explain to them? How can you make them understand exactly what's going on that's affected Africa right now? If that's possible, sir.
Well,
you know what, actually, can I tie into this question, because I think it will be answered in this way. In your books, you mentioned, in the Confessions of an Economic Hitman and the New Confessions of an Economic Hitman, you mentioned the 4 pillars of the economic hitman. So maybe address it from that perspective.
Okay,
so
I've got that there. Yeah, good, nice one. You got fear, death, insufficiency, divide and conquer.
It's not insufficiency; it's the anxiety over insufficiency. So yeah. And then divide and conquer. But go ahead. Yes, approach it from that angle, because I think it will address your question.
Okay. Yeah. So those are the 4 pillars: fear, debt, DEBT, and fear of anxiety over insufficiency, and divide and conquer. And those have been used for thousands of years, really, and throughout history. But historically, probably the biggest one was the fear, which is a military invasion, or actually having military invasion. And that's changed pretty much in recent years, except in certain parts of the world where it's been reintroduced within the last 20 years in places like Afghanistan and Iraq and in Ukraine and Gaza and on. But what's played a much bigger role is debt, DEBT. This idea that countries need to take on debt in order to benefit from their resources. So you go to a country in Africa that has, let's say, lithium, and doesn't know how to extract the lithium in a good way, and what to do with the lithium once it's extracted. So economic hitmen, whether it's from the United States or China or some European country, goes in and offers to make a big loan to this country, but they got to hire companies from their own country, China, the United States, the European country, to do the work and to make the profits, essentially. And the people typically don't benefit from this. And as I pointed out earlier, often it's the opposite of benefiting. Money is diverted from healthcare and education and other social services to pay off the interest on the debt. And in the end, the debt can't be repaid, and the collateral are the country's resources. And in some cases, the resources are human resources alone, cheap labor, that people don't get paid a living wage, and they suffer terribly, and they take these jobs because there's nothing else for them to do. We see so much of that. And so, one of the things that China has done is gone in and said, well, listen, over the last years, China brought 900 million people out of dire poverty. And that's twice the population of the United States. We had 10% economic growth for 30 years. Nobody else has ever done anything like that. Follow our system, and we won't practice neoliberalism on you. We won't force you. We won't tell you how to structure your taxes. We won't tell you to impose. We won't impose tariffs on you or sanctions. We won't do that. The United States does that, but we won't do that. And we won't invade you. We don't have a history of invading other countries like the United States does in Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan and so many other places. And then, the retort is, well, what about Taiwan? And what about Tibet? And the Chinese would say, well, those are part of China, just like the United States took half of Mexico. We don't invade African countries. We don't invade Latin American countries, and we don't assassinate leaders. And on and on with this story. And so China has really kind of turned this idea of fear around and say, fear the United States, but you don't have to fear us. And at the same time, China will guarantee to countries that its interest rates on its loans are lower than the World Bank's or the other Washington Consensus, what's known as the sister organizations of the World Bank, that China will guarantee that its interest rates will be lower. And there's a perception there that there's behind all of these things. There's a lot of it that isn't true, but there's enough, like in so many lies or so many false perceptions, there's an element of truth that people buy into. And so China will say, for the debt thing, our loans will be cheaper. We won't impose neoliberal policies. We won't tell you how to run your government. And then on the pillar of the fear of insufficiency, well, that's used pretty much the same way. Like, you're a very poor country, and we're going to help bring you out of poverty. We're going to bring you out of poverty. Our loans are going to bring you out of poverty. Both of our countries say that, both sides, the Western side and the Chinese side. And then the last one, which is divide and conquer. China says, we're doing exactly the opposite. We are building a new Silk Road across the globe. And, the Chinese economic hitman will say, hey, look, Mr. President, if you sign up with the United States, you'll get most favored nation status, which means that, you'll be able to trade with the United States under the United States' terms. But forget about your neighbors. Forget about the rest of the world. Just focus on us, the United States. Well, China says, that's not the way we do it. We're building a new Silk Road. We're going to build ports for you and airports and railroads, and we're going to connect you with your neighbors and with the whole world. You'll be part of a network. It's not about you trading with us, China. It's about connecting you with the world. So China's been very, very successful at these four, at implementing, at changing the dynamics of these four pillars of that have been traditionally behind empire building. And I think one of the questions that you're asking is, I'm reading behind this, is that what do African nations do? What do leaders in Africa do that want to get rid of this? And I think the only hope is uniting, bringing countries together and saying, we've got more resources than the rest of the world. The world wants our resources. The world wants our lithium and all these other resources. But we've got to come together, all of these countries in Africa and the different cultures that typically tend to divide with one another. The divisiveness that goes on plays right into the hands of the colonial powers, whether it's the US or Europe or China. So come together. It's about unifying, and I would say the same to Latin America. And it's not an easy thing to do, especially when you have a long history of colonialism that's intentionally divided you and broken up, different cultures, tribes, whatever you want to call them. But it's the hope for the future. And united, you can stand up to the world and say, hey, yeah, we've got the resources, but we want them used and exploited in a way that benefits our people. We want value added. We want to have the industries here. If we're going to mine lithium, we want to mine it in a way that really serves our people and gives them decent living wages and housing and food and healthcare. And we want to have the value added. So we want to produce the microchips here using the lithium. They don't have to go to someplace else.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks, Terry. Undergo, fire away. I know you got quite a few there,
Yes.
so I'll let you go, and then I'll
Yeah.
come back in, and then we got loads of questions. I think about 12 or 13 questions on here that we need to ask
Yes.
John before he. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I believe Bill Gates, and I want to address Bill Gates because currently he's very active in his role as an economic hitman. I believe he is a current economic hitman. I'm not sure if you've been following what he's doing. It's hard not to follow what he's doing because he's everywhere in Africa. So please speak about Bill Gates. And I say speak about Bill Gates because my African brothers and sisters have drunk the Kool-Aid that Bill Gates serves them before he gets on stage. And they clap for him when he walks on stages while he's feeding them poisons. So please explain to Africans that Bill Gates is not a friend and is in fact a terrorist economic hitman.
Great one.
Yeah, I think
Great one.
I'll give a little story as an example that I gave a talk at an MBA program at a US school recently. And afterwards, this young man came up to me and he says, well, why shouldn't I do what Bill Gates does? Why shouldn't I make a huge fortune, maximize profits, make a fortune, and they're going to give money to charity and do good things in the world? And my response was, well, you could probably do that, but how would you feel about it? And, maybe a better approach would be, rather than maximizing your short-term profits as you develop a company like Microsoft, imagine if Bill Gates, instead of taking all that money in, he'd really been truly, hiring people at decent wages, not cutting out the competition. Microsoft has a long history of destroying its competition. They were kicked out of Brazil for a while because they did that, and huge history of terrible exploitation. And I think if we look at philanthropy throughout the ages, you can say that once a person has all this money, it's great that they give some of the money back to philanthropy or whatever the causes are. But the bigger question is, how did they make the money and why did they do it that way? And that's not an example that we want. But Bill Gates is held out as an example, as was Jack Lynch of General Electric and the Carnegies, and throughout history, those people who've made a lot of money are held out as examples. And today we have Gates being in that same sort of position. So I think it's part of this business of standing up to exploitation in whatever form it takes. And again, I think what's really important here is for you guys to keep spreading the word. And I would focus, as I'm trying to do here now, on the bigger issue of a philanthropist, as a person who's made a lot of money, and kind of keep it away from the personalities, because if you get bogged down in the personality, Bill Gates can come across as very charismatic and very sincere. And so maybe rather than attacking the personality, you really go after the cause beneath that. What's the story behind the story? How many companies were pushed out by Microsoft? How many companies did Microsoft buy out when they started to be at all successful? And in some places, some instances, kill the technology. So a company developing a technology that would compete with Microsoft would buy them out and shut down the whole technology development unless they saw that they could use it. And over, I think there's Bill Gates is a symbol of a much larger problem.
Oladile, one more before you go to the because it's attached to the Bill Gates, because you mentioned philanthropy, right? And Africans sit and justify what he's doing and forgive his wrongs because they say now he's using his money to help. But I'm going to mention Summer Institute of Linguistics, which you mentioned in the book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. You call it SIL, S-I-L. The Summer Institute of Linguistics. And I was horrified as I was doing my research to find out that they're still in existence. And on their website, they say, we are a global faith-based nonprofit that works with local communities around the world to develop language solutions that expand possibilities for a better life. SAIL's core contribution areas are scripture translation for you Christians, literacy, education, development, linguistic research, and language tools. In the book, you share, and I'm going to actually take a minute to tell the story that you share in the book. In the book, you share about their role in Ecuador, SAIL, where they moved the indigenous people from their land into missionary reservations where they would receive free food. This is what they were telling them: move to missionary reservations because we will give you free food, shelter, clothing, medical treatment, missionary style education. They didn't call it missionary style, they called it education, good education, but it was missionary style education, under the condition that they all allowed oil companies into their lands. So SAIL missionaries used an assortment of underhanded techniques, claiming to be missionaries, but literally there to do the work of the corporations, to persuade the indigenous peoples to abandon their homes and move into the missionary reservations, even lacing the free food with laxatives. I'm being more assertive about this. You actually say allegedly in the book. You're not as assertive as I am. I'm assertive. I make no apologies. I'm going to be assertive because I'm certain, given the research and understanding these people, that they did do this. Even lacing the free food with laxatives and offering medicines to cure the diarrhea epidemic. The food baskets airdropped had tiny radio transmitters with receivers that had highly sophisticated communication stations manned by US military personnel at the army base at Shell in Ecuador, who tuned into these transmitters, and when a member of the community was bitten by a snake or became seriously ill, a SAIL representative all of a sudden showed up, arrived with anti-venom or the proper medicine, often in oil company helicopters. You give the example of the 5 missionaries who were killed by Ecuadorian revolutionaries, freedom fighters. In response, Rachel Saint, the Mzungu woman in America, goes all over the media, and she's a sister of one of the ones murdered, and she's touring the USAs and appearing on national television to raise money and support SAIL, which she claimed was helping the savages become civilized and educated. And Rockefeller funds SAIL. Given that little narrative, show us that picture in Africa. How is that being represented in Africa? Because these nonprofits are there saying they're helping our women, our children, but are they whispering in the ears of our people in Congo and displacing them so that oil companies can take over?
Well, yeah, and I can't answer that question generically. I think it depends on the nonprofit. And so, for example, I founded and am still on a board member of a nonprofit called the Pachamama Alliance, which works very hard with to help the indigenous people in Ecuador defend their lands against oil companies and mineral companies. And we wait for them to ask for help. We don't go in and try to convince them of anything. And once they ask for help, for example, they need to hire lawyers to represent them in the Congress. We'll pay for the lawyers and so forth. And so there are nonprofits that do very good work. But on the other aspect of it is the nonprofit business can be used as a shield. And what you're describing that happened in Ecuador with some Institute of Linguistics is they were to a large degree funded by one of the Rockefeller institutions. Now, the Rockefellers also, particularly at that time, had huge interest in Standard Oil in companies, and so yeah, when their seismologists discovered that there was oil in a certain area that was controlled by the Warani or the Shwa or the Kofanis or some other indigenous group, SIL would go in and promise them great food, great living conditions, education, teach them to read and write if they moved to the reservation and abandon their land. And the oil companies could then come in and exploit it. I personally have not been involved in that in Africa. I'm not sure what's going on in Africa. I haven't done that research, but I'm sure it does go on. And I'm sure it goes on with nonprofits from many different countries, or ones that claim not to be part of a country, but to be international organizations. I also think there are good nonprofits that try to turn that around and do good work. And I can say the one that I'm involved in, which primarily works in Latin America, but also it spreads programs around the world. I think we're in something like 90 countries now with programs called Changing the Dream, Awakening the Dream, or Changing the Dream, which is about transforming the death economy to a life economy. So I think again, it's not generic. You have to go in and look at each specific organization and really see what they're doing. And so theoretically, nonprofits have to make their budgets public. And certainly if they're registered in the United States, there's ways to make them do that. And they should do that anyway. But if you don't feel it is, and really take a look at it, what are they spending their money on? And some of them are spending their money on good programs. Others are supporting big corporations. And some of the corporations themselves have formed nonprofits. And of course, they do this by saying, well, we want to help the world, so we're diverting some of our profits to the nonprofit. But in some of these cases, that nonprofit is supporting that corporation's ability to exploit resources.
Okay, thank you.
I'm glad,
Yeah.
Oladile, sorry. I'm glad you said that, and I agree, because we too run nonprofits and there are good nonprofits. But I was going to quickly give a list of the ones that, and you can do this research. And by the way, you can use ChatGPT to help you with the research. You have to be very specific about the prompt that you give ChatGPT so that it can give you accurate results. And then once you get the results, you go yourself and do the research. The Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Freedom House, USAID, which you mentioned in Confessions of an Economic Hitman. Under USAID, we have 1 Acre Fund. It is not helping. It is definitely not helping. African Women's Development Fund, the Kenyan Human Rights Commission, Action Aid, the Clinton Foundation and its African partners, the Gates Foundation and its agricultural initiatives in Africa, and all the companies that it's associated with, just to name a few of the NGOs that are problematic.
Yeah. Well, that's good that you're making a list like this and keeping it up and go after them.
Thank you. Okay, John, I'm going to start asking some questions here because we've got quite a few because of time. I'm going to go with the first one. And you can hear me. Okay, the first one says, how do we disrupt the status quo? How do we navigate the negative implications, in terms of the blocking assassinations? How do we navigate it? How do we disrupt it without being killed and all that kind of stuff? How can we do that? How can they not stop send the jackals behind people? That's the first question I've got here.
I'll say if you have the answer to that, John Perkins. Go ahead, though.
Well, it's changing perception. It's really that's at the heart of it. The jackals and all of these negatives that we've talked about are all based on this idea of maximizing short-term profits, regardless of the social and environmental costs. And that's the death economy. And so we must, if we want to take a general view of all of this, turn this around and say, no, the goal is to maximize long-term benefits for all life. And that's the life economy. Maximize long-term benefits for all life. And yes, corporations need to make short-term profits, some short-term profits to survive, but they don't have to maximize them. They can pour some of that money back into helping their employees, providing healthcare and retirement funds, and also investing in local communities where they're building their plants, build recreation facilities, libraries, schools, really help the communities.
And paying taxes in Africa where they are operating.
Yeah, exactly. In the US, many of our Fortune 500 companies who make huge profits, they don't pay any taxes. That's outrageous. It's outrageous. They use and in Africa, they use all the infrastructure. They call in the police, they call in the fire departments, they use the airports and the ports and airports, but they don't pay taxes. How do they justify that? But it's justified around the world. Interestingly, China has an answer to that one too, in that most of its big corporations are owned at least 51% by the Chinese government. So it doesn't matter whether they pay taxes or not, because the government gets the money anyway. Of course, the question is, how does the government use the money? But the government has pulled well over 800 million people out of dire poverty, and some say 900 million. I don't know the actual number, but it's a lot. And so, but they don't have to worry about taxes because they have ownership in this, which is an interesting approach. So no, I think I got off the mark here. What am I answering?
Okay, I'll leave it there anyway. Let's carry on because of time. Okay, the follow-up question to that is: do you believe that the UN is the primary conduit for Western infiltration and manipulation of the indigenous people of Africa? Is UN a conduit of infiltration and manipulation of the indigenous people of Africa?
Yeah, I think what we have to recognize about the UN and the World Bank and many of these other institutions is that the people that end up running those organizations mostly come from, they were ministers of finance or ministers of development or presidents of other countries. They have a huge stake in the status quo. There's no question about it. That's their stake. And this also gets back into your earlier question, and that is, we are at a time in history now when people around the world are waking up. I'm blessed with an opportunity to speak. I just came back from Latin America. I go again in January, and I'm teaching at some American universities this year, and next week actually. And I visited recently in Europe. I travel around quite a bit. I haven't been to Africa for a while, but everywhere I go, I find that people are waking up. There's a consciousness revolution. We're getting it, and how can you not get it? The deserts are expanding all over Africa, and there's droughts and there's droughts and floods at the same time. We got it. We're getting it. People are getting it. But whenever there's a revolution, and this is a consciousness revolution, there's always blowback. There's always an attempt by the status quo to stop it. And so we're seeing that big time now. And a lot of these institutions are very much involved in trying to stop the change. I think a lot of the people in the United Nations, whatever the overriding goal of the United Nations is, it's dependent on the individuals that are running it and are in charge. And a lot of those individuals are very, very tied to the status quo. And it's also very frustrating that the United Nations is conveniently ignored. It doesn't have power, it doesn't have the teeth. It stood up very strongly against the United States in invading Iraq. And yet the United States, President Bush completely ignored the United Nations, completely ignored it. I think there were 7 different votes against invading Iraq, and the United States just ignored them. So does it have teeth? No. And who is in positions of leadership in these organizations? And for the most part, those are people that are tied in with the status quo. But I think the rest of us take strength from that, because throughout history, when there's ever been a revolutionary movement of any kind, there's always been resistance on the part of the status quo. And the job of the revolutionaries, and in this case, it's consciousness revolution. I don't think we need to take up guns we may in some places, but it's basically a consciousness change. That how do we change consciousness? And I'm finding that people around the world are getting it, but there's this pushback. Now, I've been a martial artist most of my life. And I know that as a martial artist, if you're up against if I'm up against a guy who's stronger, bigger and stronger than me, I don't try to overpower him. I got to use his energy against him. And you could say the same for the status quo. When we see that there's an attempt to stop this consciousness change, this consciousness revolution, this change of perception, the people who are trying to stop it, we take energy from that. We don't give in to them. We don't quit. We don't give in to them, but we don't try to overpower them either. We use their energy against them. And so we keep talking about the need to change the perception of what it means to be human beings, being human on this planet. We've got to keep changing that perception. It's not about materialistic consumption. It is about, having all of our life needs met in the best way possible, but not about maximizing consumption or maximizing profits.
I'm so glad you said that. Oladele, I know you need to go to the audience quickly, but I will be remiss if I don't bring this up. You mentioned blowback, and I'm glad you mentioned the UN and whichever other entities, including the United States State Department, are involved with the UN, because that's who they work with, right? They're global outside of the United States. So recently, Blinken, the United States Secretary, came out and condemned an African outlet, African Stream, and claimed, and this is always the line with African revolutionaries, they are tied to Russians, or they are being pushed by Russians to do this, as if African people need the white man to tell them that they are being oppressed, as if African people need the white man to tell them that they need to get up and rise. So multiple things that are wrong with that, right? The racism in his comment, the insult to our intelligence in his comment, but also the crime of stopping free press from operating. Kenya is not held under United States government laws. And if Facebook is going to do work globally, then Facebook must comply to other nations' laws, not just the United States. So please address that as you're talking. And these are the efforts that they're doing to block us. How I have said several times, I tell my brothers and sisters, we cannot use the oppressor's legal system to fight the oppressor. We have to actually break the oppressor's legal system and create our own legal system to fight the oppressor. So please say something about that.
Well, I'm completely with you on that. And it's the same as you can't use the systems of the death economy to create a life economy. And you can't, we've got to change all that. But going back to your question, your idea that Blinken talking about Russia being behind these movements, that's just such an old theme. Again, it's fear combined with divide and conquer. And, it's been used throughout history. And, because you can't, the idea being that you can't tell the American people that it's some local group in Africa that they don't have any fear of at all, because they're just there. They're just there in Africa. I don't even know who those people are that you're talking about. But if you tell the American people it's the Russians who we fear because they get nuclear armaments, or it's the Chinese, then you can get the American people to rally behind you, conceivably. But, and so, yes, it's extremely racist. It's extremely degrading. It's extremely just writing people off as not being able to do it themselves. I've seen this over and over and over again. Again, my main experience has been in Latin America, where, the threat of the red tide of communism. There was no red tide of communism back in the 70s in Latin America whatsoever. There were socialists. Yes, these presidents like Roldos of Ecuador and many others were socialists. And I'm sure you've got the same thing in Africa, where you've got people that are involved in movements that may be socialistic, and the United States comes in and says, well, those are communistic. Those are communists. They're not communists at all. Those are being backed by the Russians. They're not being backed by the Russians at all necessarily. But that's the politics behind it. That's what scares the American people. So Blinken's addressing the American people. He's not addressing the Africans. He's addressing the American people. He's saying, hey, we got to help out in Kenya or wherever, because otherwise the Russians will take over. It's very sad, but it's very manipulative, and it's as old as empire.
Wow. All right. I've got another one here for you, John. This man's saying, how do you liberate young Africans from the shackles of the economic?
Please highlight them when you read them, the questions, so that they show up on the screen. Okay.
Yeah, okay. How do you liberate young Africans from the shackles of the continent of shackles of the economic hitman? How do you liberate young Africans? Because a lot of young Africans are trying to do something, like I said, revolutionary at the moment. But how do you liberate them from not going into the shackles of the economical hitman?
Well, obviously, I can't liberate them, but the person who asked the question can, and other Africans can. You've got to liberate yourselves. But
I am. Oh, hold on, John, real quick. I am so glad you, a Caucasian man, is telling them, because they don't hear me, their fellow sister. You, a Caucasian man, is telling them, stop looking for liberation in me. I can't give it to you. Please go on.
Yeah. So, all I can do is expose what I know about the system that I've been part of. But you've got to do the rest. The person who asked that question obviously is thinking a lot about this. And I would suggest get out there and rally the forces, not just in your country, but in all the countries around you, and realize the power that you've got. My God, like Africa has all these resources. And one of the reasons that China is so interested in Africa is that China's population is aging rapidly, right? As we all know, that's a problem. What I think the average age of Africa is 19, I believe, or something like that.
Very, 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 very young.
Very young.
Youngest population in the world, yeah.
Yeah. So China, and to a degree, the United States is kind of just hasn't gotten there yet, but because it's so involved in the Middle East, but is looking at the Chinese young people as being their slaves. Saying, yeah, well, our population is getting too old, so we're going to draw on the younger population of Africa. In addition to all the natural resources you have that are in the ground, you've also got incredible human resources. We want them. But that gives you tremendous power, especially the young people. Don't let it happen. Rally, come together, unite, and stand up to these powers around the world. And
Thank you.
That's the way it's going to work. But the guy who asked the person who asked the question, whether it's a guy or a gal or whatever it is, you're in a great position to make this happen. Follow your dream. That's your dream. Follow your dream. I can't do it, but you can.
Thank you very much for that one. I love that answer. Okay, I've got another one here. I'm just posting it up on the chat. Oh, sorry. What am I doing? Okay.
I don't read chats anyway. I can't.
Oh, yeah, okay.
I can't multitask. I don't think anybody can multitask. But
we're trying to do our best to do so. So yes.
Okay.
Yeah, you do it. You
okay. The question here says, knowing how the game is played, how do we learn defenses?
And I will say, as our fellow African brothers and sisters continue to ask these questions, you realize that we brought John so that he can expose the system. The solutions will have to be us. The only thing John can tell you is what they do so that we can learn about our enemy. The solutions will have to be us. Go on, John Perkins, please.
Absolutely. The solutions have to be you. And I think it also has to be each individual. As I suggested, ask yourself these 5 questions. What can I do? What do I most want to do? So I don't know who this person who's asking this question, which I'm reading right now. Knowing how the game is played is how we learn defenses. Well, if that person's a writer, then write about these things. If that person is a plumber, then when you're working on people's plumbing, talk about these things. If that person is a teacher or a student or whatever your role in life is, we all have a role to play in this. So we all constantly have to keep changing that perception from exploiting the earth, from maximizing short-term profits at huge environmental and social cost. We need to keep spreading that. And each individual, every one of us, has tremendous power, more than we realize. We all have networks. And today with social networking, we've really got a lot more than we ever had before. I mean, anyone out there listening, if you're pissed off at some particular company or some particular politician or whatever, write an email. And my suggestion, and I've done some of this too, so for example, I might write an email to the president of Nike. And I'd say, hey, Nike, I love your products, but I'm not going to buy them anymore until you pay your workers in Indonesia a fair wage. And I love your products, but I'm not going to buy them anymore until you do that. And once you do that, then I'll spread the word that you're doing that, and you'll be honest your competition. And then you send that to all your social networking circles, and you ask them to send it to all of theirs. And we go about this in a smart way where we try to appeal to that side of human nature that's there in a lot of people in high positions. I also admit that I realize there's a lot of sociopaths there and narcissists who don't give a damn. But you know what? The narcissists and the sociopaths want to be successful. That's what they want. It's not money. Yeah. But we've defined success in terms of money. And so right now, that's what they strive for. But if we turn that around and say, we're going to put on the covers of our magazines, we're going to interview on our programs the people that are driving us toward a life economy. If they become our heroes, then the sociopaths and the narcissists will buy into that too. They will want to be on the top of that list. They will want to lead that group of people. And we go back to the idea of Bill Gates and the student who said to me, why shouldn't I be like Bill Gates? Well, what if that person had said, I want to be like Mother Teresa, or pick any hero. I want to whatever it is. So we set ourselves up with heroes. We've done this for most of my lifetime. The heroes are the ones that make the most money, the most profit. Incidentally, we've done that in sports too. What athlete is making the most money in the world today? What soccer player, football player, whatever it is making the most money? And that guy's really great, and I want to be like that. No, cut it out.
That's a distraction.
It's a huge distraction, but it's also sending this message that you want to make money. Okay, I can't play football, but I can create a company that may make me rich, like Bill Gates did. So that's what I got to do, because I got to do what I do best. And it's not play football in my case. And in my case, it's writing books. But if we do that and we say, but I'm only going to do it in a way that helps transform the death economy to a life economy, then we will get there. We can all take different paths. All of us take different paths. Whatever our passion is, we follow that path, but we head toward the same destination, which is a life economy.
The way I simplify that, because a lot of people accuse me of thinking of a utopia when I talk about the solutions. And the way I simplify it, you call it the death economy. But the simplest way I put it is, if you're doing something and you realize it's exploiting someone, not even many people, just one person, walk away. That's not the solution. So as long as exploitation is a factor in your solution or your passion, stop. Find another passion. Find something else to do. And John Perkins calls it the death economy because it is the system that we are dealing with. Quickly, Olade, before you go to the questions in the chat, there's one more here, because I want to address the issues that are truly affecting our continent, our motherland. They have told us several times we are corrupt, right? The other day I was reading 23 things they don't tell you about capitalism. And these white men, and I call them white men, not women, because as you have stated clearly in your book, and as we all know, it is the white men behind the closed doors who are controlling the system. Even their own women don't have full rights to operate. They don't even get equal payment, right? So they come and tell us that we are very corrupt because we have so many resources, we are lazy, and we are corrupt, and we are prone to conflict. And so in your book, you mentioned two cases, and I want to point them out because I'm always telling people the United States has a great case of corruption. Huge. The judges, the policemen, the teachers, the institutions, but people don't see that. They see them as the standard of morality for whatever reason. So here we go. You give the case of Harkin Oil Company, where George W. Bush, at the time when his father was president, Amoco, which is another oil company, I'm not saying Amoco is the better of the two, but Amoco, which was another oil company, was bidding for drilling rights in Bahrain at the time, had been doing it for months before Harkin jumps in from nowhere, right after George W. Bush becomes a member of their board and his president becomes president. And they are assigned the drilling rights. Amoco is pushed aside. And not only are they assigned the drilling rights, his father is president at this time. Not only, for those of you who want to follow Biden's son claiming all Democrats are corrupt, Republicans are corrupt as well. All of them are corrupt. But not only do they win the drilling rights, but they get exclusive drilling rights, which means no other company can get drilling rights in that area. And then you give the story of Ronald Reagan. And I love that you say, and there are moments as dark as the book is, dark because it's revealing such a horrific truth about the system, and it's very angering. You mentioned that you you found it fitting that Ronald Reagan was a Hollywood actor because he followed orders from moguls, the Hollywood industry, right? And would be ideal for this role where he'd be doing the same in his capacity as US president, essentially, there to serve the interests of moguls. So no matter whether you have a Republican president, a Democrat president, the president of the United States is there to serve the money interests. So please talk about this. The fact that there's corruption within the United States and the fact that their government is run by their financial institutions.
You know, I just met recently with a former president of Ecuador who has a PhD in economics from the University of Illinois. He knows his stuff. He was president for 10 years of Ecuador. And he's been accused of corruption. And I don't know whether there's any truth or not, but probably, who knows? But he said to me, I was on a television show with him out of Mexico City, and he said to me, he said, you know, the United States is the largest banana republic in the world without bananas. And yeah, and yes, the corruption in this country is phenomenal, but it's at this very high level. Like, I don't have to pay somebody to, you know, to mail a letter. I don't have to slip somebody money under the table to give to, because I'm afraid they'll steal my stamp otherwise, and so on and so forth. These forms of what I'd call petty corruption, which are not that prevalent in the United States at all. They are there. They're there with the police, for example. You can pay off a policeman and not get a fine. Some policemen, not all of them by any means, but we're corrupt on this huge level, where our corporations have so much power. As I mentioned before, you know, you mentioned they don't pay taxes, and you know, they have the right to invest huge amounts of money in political campaigns. The CEO of a big corporation has a lot more votes than I do. He only gets one vote when he goes to the polling station, but he's spent a huge amount of money on promoting the person he wants to win, and that's power. And on so many levels, there's this extreme corruption in the United States, but it's legalized. So strictly speaking, it isn't corruption. It's legal. And that's part of this death economy, this idea that do whatever you need to do to maximize short-term profits. And that includes passing laws that support what otherwise would be known as corruption. But once the law is passed, it's no longer corrupt, but it is. It's terrible, terrible corruption, and it's rampant in the United States.
I'm so glad you said once the law is passed, because look at the screen, please. Let's talk about that law, because it's very prevalent right now as far as our continent goes. This is the law that is allowing Bill Gates and Monsanto to be doing what they're doing. HR 1599, the Dark Act. Are you familiar with it?
I'm not.
So in HR 1599, I will quickly say, you don't have to address it since you're not familiar with it. So the United States Congress, with more than 230 plus votes, passed this bill, and it's now law. It's a policy that allows companies to call GMO products natural. They know very well that their products are GMO, but they call them natural. Right. And this is go ahead, please.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's obviously a big case of corruption. I'm not quite sure what the question is. As you speak of that corruption, please address. I think, you know, it's deeply corrupt, and it's obvious who's behind all this. The big agribusiness companies.
I guess the thing is, please explain how this could be harmful for Africans, because as we had gotten to a system where we went to the store and we looked at the product and it said, okay, natural, I'm good. But now we can't even trust that. But these are the people who are selling seeds on our continent. These are the people who are advising us on farming. Can you imagine Bill Gates, Microsoft, what's it called? I'm forgetting. The joke did not come quickly enough into my head. But white shirt wearing man, you know, talking about advising Africans on farming, has never farmed in a day. So please explain how this could be farming and harmful to Africans when the United States is giving its corporations laws that protect their criminality, and they can go out and actually say that something that they know is truly harmful is not, and you go ahead and buy it.
Yeah, And we have faced the same thing in the United States recently. It's become very obvious that the oil companies knew that they were causing climate change and didn't talk about it way back in the 70s. I think the answer to that is you Africans have to stop it. The United States Congress isn't going to stop it because they're corrupt, because they're financed by the big agribusinesses. Monsanto's got a lot of power, and so do all the other big agribusiness companies in the United States. But if you come together and you pass your own laws that prohibit this, that's the way to stop it. Again, it's like, what can I do in the United States up against these huge interests? I can keep exposing them. But there's no reason at all why every African country, and maybe Africa as a continent, comes together and says and passes their own law that changes all of that and actually creates a system for labeling what truly is organic and what isn't organic, or just kicks these companies out, kicks the companies out, and creates your own system of collecting seeds. In fact, the world needs you to do that. It's not just for Africa. Do it for the world. Create your own system, and don't let the bullies push you around. The bullies, the United States, the agribusinesses, the US Congress, they're pushing you around. Don't let it happen. You don't have to let it happen. Change your law.
Oladele, I'm not gonna
call to action.
I'm not gonna let that one slide.
I know, call to action.
Since you said that, John Perkins, Mbongi ya Ubuntu, the organization I'm a part with, the Emerging Alkebulan, the organization our brother is a part with, we are coming together to build a seed bank in Nigeria. We want to have it up and running in December. We need your support, everyone, your financial support. The farmer we are working with is currently working with those on the ground to put together a budget. We will have it out. We know that if we send it to organizations to give us a grant, they will come with conditionalities. We don't want that. But you, the people, if even the 96 that are here, if you give $1, that's $96 that is pushing us ahead. But I'm saying, if you have some money, instead of buying your burger and French fries at McDonald's, please go ahead and give it. Skip that burger and fries, go cook at home and send that money to us to build the seed bank. So this is one of the things that we're doing. We are hoping that by next year, the end of the year, we have one in Nigeria, one in Kenya, and one in Congo. And then eventually we want them all over the continent. But thank you, John Perkins, for saying that.
Yeah, you certainly don't want to support McDonald's. And I would go a step further and say, you don't even really want to support the beef industry. I'm a vegetarian, but I'm not asking everyone to become a vegetarian. I'm just asking you to think twice about doing that. Let's get those seeds out there. I love the fact that you've created these organizations to promote local seeds, and that's so very, very important. Let's get more and more of those seeds out there, and don't support McDonald's. I know there's people saying, well, but it's a really inexpensive, like it's a good deal. It's not inexpensive.
You can buy rice. I will be very real right now. I lost my job last year. I am currently living with no income. I am living minimally. So you can buy rice, you can buy beans, you can buy tomatoes for $10. I have made dinner with $10. So yes,
absolutely. My wife and I do that all the time. And we're both vegetarians, and I haven't always been this. For me, this just started during the pandemic because she's always been been vegetarian for many years, and she's a great chef, and she cooks great vegetarian meals. And during the pandemic, we always ate at home. Before that, I'd go out and get a hamburger or even a steak or something. But during the pandemic, I didn't do that, and I felt so much better. And the food was so good. And again, I'm not telling everybody to become a vegetarian. That's not my job to tell people what to do. But I would say, don't support McDonald's.
But because I am a meat lover, I will say, for those of us who understand because everything is about the extremes. Those of us who are on the ground raising our own animals, we know what they are eating. Then you can eat the meat from those animals because you have seen what they're eating. But if you don't know what your animals are eating, then be cautious.
Okay.
Yeah. And
all right.
I would just add to that I was once a meat lover too. We can change.
Yeah, we can change.
I
I'm
do
actually
love me
thinking
a
about
good
that.
steak, so yes,
We
that's
need-
a challenge.
All right. Okay, let's go to the questions. I got another one here, John. This one's saying, are African banks truly owned by Africans?
I don't know, frankly, and I haven't been an economic hitman since 1980, and I've been writing about the business. That's something I haven't done any research on, but what we can say for sure is they're tied into the death economy in a big way. All banks are part of the system that's based on on Federal Reserve, central bank, high interest rates, and so on and so forth. It's to me, it's essential that we move to a different form of currency and banking. And I don't know whether that's cryptocurrency or what it is, but the current system that's so manipulated by Wall Street, and now it's being manipulated to a large degree by the Chinese banks, is a system that doesn't support human beings or the planet. So it's important to change it. But as to who actually owns the African banks, I don't know. And again, I suspect that it's got to be addressed on an individual basis. I think probably every one of you can do some research and find, is there a local bank? You want to do local banks that are owned by local businesses, and not just African, like as in trans-African, but local banks, if you can find those, or form your own co-ops, savings and loan co-ops. It's so important to get into this local business and do the research and find out if there's a bank in your community, if there's a co-op or that's locally owned. Support it.
Thank you.
And
Okay,
for
let's go
those
to
of
the next
you
one.
who are asking, because we are doing the research, follow me on Medium. I'm going to put my account there. I will be posting all this information I'm getting, all the companies, the names, and all that. And yes, majority of the banks in Africa are not owned by African nations.
Okay. In your best guess, this guy's asking, is training and funding the insurgency, terrorists running rampant all over Africa, funded all over African countries that are rich? Okay, in the best educated case, who do you believe funds the insurgency in Africa in all these countries, basically, or the
In my best guess, I
yeah.
would say that the United States is doing some of it, Russia is doing some of it, China's doing some of it, some of the European nations are doing some of it, Iran may be doing some of it. I suspect that there's many different terrorist organizations that are being financed and manipulated by many of those the countries that seek to be world powers or at least have world influence.
And what that means for us Africans, again, we have John Perkins here so that we can learn about the enemy, so that we can figure out how to moving forward. What that means for us is we cannot trust the foreigners, right? And if we do choose one over the other, for example, in the case of Traore, Russians to protect him, it has to be strategically. You have to be very clear about what that relationship is. But those are solutions for another space. And also, as you speak about our solution, John Perkins, you mentioned that you don't know what the solution would be, whether it is cryptocurrency or what. Join us in December. We will put it out on our platforms. We have a virtual conference where we'll be talking about what the solution is going to be for our financial liberation. Oladele. And let's see, how much more time do we have with John?
We got about 12 minutes.
All right, go on.
Okay. I'm going to post this one up here. I'm just skipping through most of them. This one here, basically, is an interesting one. How has colonizing Africa and other third world countries really benefited the citizens of the United States of America?
Really?
Well, more than anything, it's benefited the wealthy citizens of the United States. There's a lot of people in the United States that suffer from exploitation also in their cities, in the poor parts of our cities, and many parts of the country. But certainly colonizing Africa and other third world countries has benefited the very wealthy, those who own the big corporations, those who own who are part of the military industrial complex, or what you might call the corporatocracy. They benefited tremendously by getting resources cheap. and without having to pay what we call external costs. And I think that's a big one, that you go into Africa, a company goes into Africa and it mines some material or exploits oil or whatever, and it doesn't pay its workers a fair price, and it doesn't pay for the environmental damage it's done. And from that standpoint, all citizens in the United States do benefit because we've got cheap oil here. But at what cost to the countries where the oil comes from? We've got cheap copper and cobalt and other resources here. We've got cheap meat. We talked about beef. We get cheap beef because people who are producing all of these different products in Africa and elsewhere are not being paid a fair price. They're suffering. And that's a cost, and it ought to be included in accounting. Our accounting system is terribly, terribly biased in favor of the rich. So we don't account for people who not only don't make a fair wage, but also because if they're sick, they don't get paid anything and they get laid off. Their jobs get taken away from them. That's not included in the accounting, which means that prices are a lot cheaper than they should be for many, many goods here in the United States. We should be paying a lot more for oil. We should be paying a lot more for most of our plastics. We should be paying a lot more for an awful lot of things. But because we can exploit other countries, we get away with it.
Thanks,
I
John.
just shared two books for the question that was just asked about colonization. And by the way, for Africans, stop just thinking about colonization. Every time you think about colonization, also think about the enslavement of our people. They work hand in hand in building the economies of the West. But you have How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney. That is a great book for you to understand how colonization and the enslavement of our people has built the economies of the West. Regarding the corporations and why United States can charge minimal prices for their goods, 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism by Ha-Joon Chang. He has a whole chapter on this. And if you cannot afford the books, Kumbukeni is doing lectures every Friday talking exactly about these questions that you're asking. So follow us on Twitter, on YouTube, and you can learn from the lectures that we have every Friday. Go ahead, Oladele.
Okay, just to round up, this is the final question for today. And then it says, considering this potential situations where African countries might choose to refuse the debt trap, what do you suggest as a defense against the jackals prior to unification of Africa? What do we do?
Good question. The jackal threat is usually just leveled at a few people in high positions. Most citizens don't have to worry about that. And I think to protect the people in high positions, the best thing that can be done is to continually expose the truth and what's going on. I had a lot of blowback on my books when I talked to say that the United States was behind the overthrow and death of Allende in Chile and Arbenz in Guatemala and Mossadegh in Iran and on and on. And people say, well, you're not a loyal American. You shouldn't be saying these things. But that to me is being a loyal American. And the more we can expose these things, the less likely they are to happen. As you may know from reading my book, my life was threatened when I started to write it, and the life of my daughter. And then I was offered a bribe to work for a consulting firm. I took the bribe, and because I was scared. And also, I put the money toward writing books, toward going back to the Amazon, where I'd been a Peace Corps volunteer, and to creating nonprofit organizations, and to starting movements, and to devoting the rest of my life to trying to transition to a life economy. But I did take the bribe. And then I decided after 9/11 that I had to write Confessions of an Economic Hitman. But I decided I wouldn't tell anybody I was writing it. I would do it completely in secret, unlike when I first started it. And I would write the whole book and then get it in the hands of publishers. Once the information is out there in the public, it becomes much more difficult for the jackals to do their job because it makes people martyrs. So I knew that once I got this book, this manuscript out into publishers and it got out to the public, the jackals will know that if they assassinate me, I become a martyr and it sells lots of books. So the best defense really is exposure and the truth.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, we have to recognize that it does take courage to stand up to these things. But
It does.
it's also a lot of joy, you know? I mean,
Yeah.
In a weird way, yes, because there's a lot of pain, but in a weird way, yes, it's very gratifying to actually do what is right.
it is.
I'm glad you said that, because a lot of people say to me, you can't say everything, you can't be so loud. And I actually used to work for the Department of Justice, so I somewhat understand these systems. And I say to them, the only way to deal with them is to be loud and proud. You
Yes.
are not apologizing. They have access to everything. Listen, the reason why they arrested the owner of Telegram is because they want access. So they pinned something on him because he's been refusing to give them access.
Yeah.
They have access on everything. Every space you think you're hiding, there is. If they don't have access legally, they have covert operators who are there pretending to be someone you don't know and gathering information. So when you do things in secret, you're giving them the power to come out and say you are being financed by Russians, because no one knows who's financing you. You're doing things in secret. But if you're a loud mouth, and a transparent loud mouth, they cannot pin things on you because everyone knows what you're about. Go ahead, Oladile.
Okay, John, just before we round up, our last guest left a question for you. He didn't know who was coming, but this question was so fitting for you. And the question he left was, what is your purpose for being here? Is it an authentic purpose?
Well, I don't know what authentic means. I guess my purpose in life right now is to take care of my grandson and all his brothers and sisters in Africa and Latin America and everywhere else, and not just the human brothers and sisters, but all of nature. You know, that's my purpose. And is that authentic? It's selfish, perhaps, I think, in terms of my grandson, but I know that he can't have a good life if all of his brothers and sisters around the planet don't have a good life. So, and I would say too, that I feel blessed to have this opportunity. And I would like to just close myself by speaking to everybody out there and saying, I think we should all feel blessed to be alive right now, because the earth is speaking to us. There's no question about it. The earth is speaking to us. And we should feel blessed that we are in a position to listen. And I think Africans particularly, you've got this continent that's filled with resources, including, as we mentioned earlier, the youth of your continent, the youngest continent in the world for human age, and the most resources. So you're blessed to have the opportunity to move forward into really taking a leadership role and turning this whole damn system around. You know, it reeks. The death economy is degenerative. It's heading us toward disaster. It's time to turn it around. And I think you guys should feel very blessed that you're in this position to talk about it. I feel blessed that I'm in this position to talk about it, to expose the terrible mistakes we've made. And also, we've done some amazing things. You know, the fact that we're communicating with each other is a modern technology. Science, technology, medicine, we've done amazing things, but we've gone too far. And it's time to turn it around. And if Africa doesn't take the lead, who's going to?
Well,
that's a big question. If Africa doesn't take the lead,
exactly,
who's going to? You've got the resources. You've got the young population. You've been terribly exploited in the past, and you still are exploited, but turn that around and look at this as an amazing, wonderful challenge, an opportunity to dance. Dance into revolution, consciousness revolution.
I want to, and it's very interesting because we are great dancers. We can tear the place apart with our dancing. But anyway, I digress. I want to take advantage of this last minute to have you tell this quick story, because this one now is specifically for the white people who are confronted by their conscience, who are confronted by our ancestors, because yes, our ancestors are confronting you. They will remind you that a reckoning is coming and it must be done, and who have a hard time actually admitting their role in the past and changing, right? You talk about once you leave Maine, the company that you were working under, that the NSA recruited you in, where you were doing most of your economic hitman assignments. Once you leave there, and Panama, I believe at this time, Panama City has been attacked. You get on your boat and you go to an island, I forget which one, and you're on the cliff on that island, and that was a plantation. And you reflect and you look within and you realize that where you're standing is a plantation where several of our ancestors went through a lot of atrocities that the United States carried out against them. And at one point, while you're going through that, you pick up a stick and you hit the wall so hard in your frustration that you collapse. Please talk about that moment and what makes you walk away, despite the fact that you knew you were a part of this system, you contributed to this system, but you must do something different now.
Yeah. And I just want to explain, if you hear some strange noises in the background, it's my cat.
That's okay. That's okay.
She's cheering me on. She always does this. Yeah, you know, I just felt so angry at the system, but then at myself for being part of that system. So angry. And what I would learn later, and it's ascribed to now, and I would suggest for everyone, is that our emotions are just energy. And if you're feeling angry, that's great. Or if you're feeling sad or whatever you're feeling, admit to it. It's the actions you take as a result. So, you know, the actions I took out of my anger before, when I was angry that I was raised kind of as a poor teacher's son and so on and so forth. And so the anger, I directed that anger at making a lot of money. But now I direct the anger, and I directed the anger that you're talking about, beating the tree. Now I direct my anger at writing books and talking with you and speaking at events. And so I would suggest to everybody, you know, let your anger be there, but direct it in ways that facilitate change and that bring you joy and happiness. I love what I'm doing. I'm really, really angry, and I'm having a lot of fun with it.
Yes, so it is okay to be angry. And John Perkins' advice, for those of you who want to get advice from the Mzungu, is that we should unite. Mzungu is the Swahili word for white man, John Perkins. We should unite as African nations because our unity is our power, it's our strength. Oladele?
Yeah, thank you, John. I'm just going to sum it up anyway. Like John said, we say this, Unduku says this all the time, and we've been saying this for a long time. It's time for the Alkebulan Awakening. We are our own solutions. I've said this all the time. We don't have to look anywhere. Everything we need is within us. Somebody was asking about the dollar. Why do you want to back the dollar with your resources? Why can't we all create our own currency? We don't need the dollar. We don't need the yen. We need our own currency. So actually, you know, this is basically what we're talking about. Stop using our Western solutions to solve our problems, because it's not going to work for us. Anyway, John, finally, can you please leave us a question for the next guest, please, sir?
Who's your next guest?
We don't tell.
Oh.
We don't tell.
Well, it's hard to ask a question of something I don't know. I feel like
it's called spirituality, John Perkins. Just trust and believe that your question will land to the right person.
All right.
What is your heart telling you right now?
All right. So the question for the next guest is, what brings you the greatest bliss in life, and how can you use this to make future generations grateful for what you do with the rest of your life?
That's absolutely brilliant. That's very fitting. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for the work you're doing.
Thank you, John.
You're exposing them. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks for the work you guys do. Keep it up. My God, yes. Yeah. Keep pushing those Africans.
If they don't shut us down, you never know. We might be the next target for Blinken, that we are funded by Russians.
Guys, you've heard from John. He's told us we are our own solutions. I'm just reiterating it. We are our own solutions. Don't look anywhere else. We have all the solutions we need within ourselves. John, thank you very much for your time. If